somewhere deep in the Alabama River Valley, between the sprawling cotton estates of Montgomery County and the shadowed remnants of the old Creek territories. A secret sleeps, a truth that was never meant for your eyes or ears. Imagine a sealed courthouse record, hidden for decades, containing the testimony of 7 enslaved men and women who witnessed something that defied understanding. Not a story of superstition, not a whispered ghost tale, but a calculated, deliberate series of rituals orchestrated by Helena Rutledge, the richest widow in Montgomery, in the year 1845. What they saw was so dangerous, so corrupting to the social order, that the court sealed their statements first for 50 years, then indefinitely. And 3 of those witnesses vanished from the records entirely within 6 months. Helena Rutledge inherited everything at 27. Her husband's vast cotton estate, nearly 800 acres of bottomland along the river, hundreds of enslaved people, and the wealth to bend the rules of society. Most widows would have remarried, sold the property, or sunk quietly into the social expectations of the South. But Helena did none of that. Instead, she dismissed her overseer, took control of the plantation herself, and began disappearing into the shadows, forests, libraries, private offices, even the workshops of obscure scholars who mapped forgotten corners of Alabama. She immersed herself in knowledge far beyond the understanding of ordinary people, until the whispers began among both the enslaved and the white families who observed her with unease. The first recorded ritual occurred on March 13, 1845. A large cellar beneath Willowbend Plantation, dark, damp, echoing with stone walls, was prepared meticulously by Esther and her daughter Celia. Helena ordered chairs arranged in the center. No light permitted, no explanation given. 3 women arrived in a covered carriage. They were not social guests. They were emissaries of a system unseen, speaking in tongues no one recognized, voices precise, commanding, binding themselves to a purpose, to a method, to a future that would not be denied. The ritual was punctuated by sounds no human should hear, metal on stone, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing like a clock measuring some unseen power. By dawn, Helena reemerged as if nothing had occurred, perfectly composed, giving orders to the enslaved, moving through the estate as the mistress she appeared to be. But those who had seen the cellar knew better. A mark appeared on her wrist, a small black symbol, absorbing light, intersecting lines with a circle at the center. A sigil of authority, secrecy, and control. This was not superstition. This was knowledge, carefully hoarded, carefully enacted, and deadly in its implications. The shadows of Willowbend were alive with observation. Eyes that had learned to watch without being seen. Hearts that recognized danger instinctively. And in that moment, those 7 witnesses, standing in the periphery of power and ritual, were forever altered. This was a story of a widow, a plantation, and a secret that could twist the course of history if allowed to escape the cellar. By the spring of 1845, the pattern was undeniable. Every 3 weeks, like clockwork, the midnight carriage arrived. Helena's rituals were no longer isolated events, they were a disciplined, recurring operation, a choreography of power performed in darkness. The enslaved people, forced into proximity, began noticing the subtle transformations. The walls of the cellar etched with strange scratches, symbols that seemed to pulse with intent. Whispered words in unrecognizable languages that lingered in the air long after the participants had gone. And Helena herself, increasingly distant yet magnetic, moving with the confidence of someone who had breached the boundaries of ordinary life. Esther, who cleaned the cellar, began to notice changes in Helena's manner. Her mistress no longer seemed merely a widow in control of property. Helena was conducting herself as though she were invoking forces beyond understanding, forces that could shape wealth, influence, even destiny. Small objects began appearing in the cellar after the ritual's amulets, pieces of parchment, vials of liquid that smelled faintly metallic. Each item was placed with precision, as though Helena were building something, assembling a network of symbols and energies invisible to the casual eye. The women's movements during the ceremonies were exact, their voices synchronized, chanting in harmony in a tongue no scholar could identify. It was methodical, disciplined, and unervingly cold. Helena also began marking her closest female companions with the same sigil on her wrist, a tiny but precise brand that signaled loyalty, knowledge, and complicity. These marks spread silently through Montgomery's elite, unnoticed by the public but observed by those attuned to the subtle language of power. Each ritual, each mark, each repetition reinforced something deeper. A network of influence, a framework of control designed to outlast the immediate moment. What Helena was building was not superstition, it was institutionalized secrecy. A psychological web that bent human behavior without coercion, using fascination, fear, and the allure of forbidden knowledge. Moses, who worked the fields and had lived long enough to see the patterns in white society, suspected at first that these were mere clandestine business meetings, a way for women to bypass legal limitations. But as the months passed, even his pragmatic mind recognized the unnatural nature of Helena's actions. The air around the cellar felt charged, oppressive, like a current flowing through the earth itself. Objects moved, shadows deepened, and those who witnessed the rituals found themselves unconsciously attuned to Helena's presence. Her will seemed to extend beyond her body, reaching into minds, commanding attention, invoking loyalty without force. And the young, impressionable Celia, drawn repeatedly to the cellar, began to feel an unfamiliar stir, a combination of dread and intrigue, as though the rituals were a key, unlocking a door inside her that she did not yet understand existed. The forbidden had a rhythm, and it was seductive. It demanded observation, compliance, and eventually participation. Each ceremony was a lesson in discipline, secrecy, and dominance, forces that could shape not only those present but the wider community, silently, invisibly, irreversibly. By mid-1845, Willowbend was no longer just a plantation. It had become a laboratory of human observation, a theater of hidden power where Helena Rutledge experimented with influence and control on those around her. The 7 selected enslaved individuals, Esther, Celia, Moses, Isaiah, Rachel, Thomas, and Benjamin, were no longer simply witnesses. They were participants in a system that blurred the line between fear and fascination, a psychological apparatus designed to bend their perception of reality. Helena had cultivated an environment where obedience was rewarded, curiosity tolerated only when it served her, and disobedience punished subtly but permanently. The rituals had evolved. They no longer began or ended with Helena's incantations. They were now accompanied by objects whose purposes were opaque, small figurines carved from dark wood, etched with symbols that corresponded to marks she'd placed on her own skin. She measured the angles of light and shadow in the cellar, aligning each chair, each participant, each gesture with a precision that suggested an architecture of unseen forces. The language she spoke, the one that twisted through unfamiliar syllables, was repeated in tones meant to embed rhythm, order, and compliance into the minds of those who heard it. Helena's knowledge was not academic. It was operative. Every syllable, every motion, every symbol functioned as part of a deliberate program to instill loyalty, awareness, and fear. Rachel, cleaning the cellar after one ritual, discovered scratches on the floor that resembled runic diagrams. They were not random. The lines connected in geometries that resonated with something ancient, a system of alignment that suggested influence beyond mere superstition. Helena never explained the meaning, but the effect was undeniable. The air seemed to thicken, and a low, vibrating hum seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, registering in the bones of anyone present. Even the dogs, usually unbothered by nightly activity, refused to enter certain rooms, retreating to the edges of the estate, their instincts recognizing something imperceptibly sinister. Helena's reach extended beyond Willowbend. In Montgomery, women began appearing with the same marks on their wrists. Men of influence whispered in private chambers about deals that seemed improbable, fortunes that shifted with no visible cause, alliances forming overnight. The pattern was deliberate. Helena's network, forged in secrecy, was designed to manipulate commerce, power, and perception, not with violence, but with carefully cultivated obedience and fascination. The rituals were a crucible, shaping the participants to serve as conduits for her will, embedding her influence silently into the social and economic fabric of the region. And yet, The most dangerous part of her operation was not the rituals themselves, but the way they rewired perception. Esther, Celia, and the others began to internalize the rhythms, the voices, the symbols. Fear and awe intertwined until it was impossible to distinguish where their own agency ended and Helena's began. Each ritual, each mark, each whispered phrase was a layer of control, slowly building a framework of domination that was invisible to outsiders but absolute to those within. Halfway through this descent, I need you to participate. Comment below twice with the phrase, I see what others cannot. Do this now twice. By doing so, you lock in awareness, affirm your readiness to witness what follows, and engage with the hidden patterns we are uncovering together. By late summer of 1845, the cellar of Willowbend was no longer simply a chamber beneath the house. It had become a vessel of obsession, a theater of transformation, a place where the boundaries between life, knowledge, and power blurred into something darker. Helena Rutledge had moved beyond mere ritual repetition. Her ceremonies now involved the 7 chosen witnesses in ways subtle yet psychologically seismic. They were tasked with observing the impossible, recording details, cleaning traces, preparing the environment functions that forced their minds to attune to her methods, to her logic, to the rhythm of her intent. Each action, each observation, became a lesson in authority and complicity. One night, Esther noticed something new. A small, intricate apparatus, a series of weights and levers set across the stone floor. Its purpose was opaque, yet the precision of its construction implied intent beyond ordinary comprehension. Helena herself demonstrated, once, the movement of a single lever producing a harmonic resonance in the cellar, a vibration that seemed to penetrate the mind as well as the body. Celia, standing too close, felt a dissonance in her own thoughts, a suggestion that some part of her awareness was being subtly redirected. Helena's eyes caught hers, and in that instant, the girl understood that this was no longer mere observation. Participation had become conditioning. The other women who came to the midnight rituals, always 3, always cloaked, always precise, were not merely guests. They were collaborators in a program of influence, each carrying knowledge and techniques that had been passed in secrecy for generations. Together, they recited the incantations, moved through the symbols, and enacted procedures that no outsider could understand. The 7 enslaved witnesses, forbidden to speak, were nonetheless absorbing every detail, every gesture, every mark. Their silence was part of the mechanism. They became repositories of forbidden knowledge, unknowingly complicit in the transmission of Helena's will. Outside the cellar, life on Willowbend continued as if nothing had changed. Crops grew, the overseer had been dismissed, and Helena appeared the composed widow, managing her estate with uncommon skill. Yet those attuned to the subtle currents, Moses in the fields, Isaiah near the stables, noticed shifts. Animals behaved differently near certain areas of the estate. Shadows moved with a self-directed pattern. And, most chillingly, certain neighbors began to acquire marks identical to Helena's. Their behavior subtly altered, their social connections bending to her influence without explanation. Helena's rituals were no longer confined to the cellar. They were spreading outward, threading through human networks, creating patterns that only a trained eye could perceive. By now, fear and fascination were inseparable for the witnesses. Every ritual left a residue, a psychological imprint, that lingered long after the chamber emptied. The sound of distant metal striking stone, the echo of foreign syllables, the sight of the black sigil on wrists, these were the tools Helena used to cultivate dominance, to shape perception, to normalize the impossible. For those 7 witnesses, Willowbend had become both a place of dread and a masterclass in the mechanics of control. Each day, each night, they fell further into the orbit of a mind that had learned how to manipulate reality itself. By early September of 1845, Willowbend had transformed into a crucible of hidden influence and clandestine power. Helena Rutledge's rituals, once inscrutable and symbolic, had begun to manifest consequences that were tangible, even terrifying. The 7 witnesses, their roles now firmly cemented, sensed a shift. The ceremonies had moved beyond observation and conditioning. They were exercises in authority, dominance, and psychological manipulation that touched not just those present, but the very environment of the estate. Helena's presence alone now dictated behavior, subtly bending actions and thoughts without a single overt command. One night, Rachel, tasked with cleaning the chamber after a particularly elaborate gathering, discovered a series of scratches on the brick floor that formed a geometric pattern. Each line intersected with precision, concentric circles connecting nodes at specific intervals, as though mapping some hidden framework of power. Helena observed silently as Rachel traced the pattern with her fingers, correcting her movements with the faintest gesture, her eyes glinting in the lantern light. The pattern was more than decoration, it was a grid, a system of influence, a physical manifestation of authority, calculated to shape perception and obedience. Each ritual added to the network, layering invisible connections that extended beyond the cellar walls. The three women Helena invited had become accomplices in a complex program of control. They spoke in coded syllables, performed gestures that triggered subtle responses in the observers, and left the cellar each time with marks or symbols hidden under their gloves. These gatherings were no longer private ceremonies, they were exercises in constructing a lattice of psychological dominance, teaching Helena how to extend her will into the minds of the enslaved, the neighboring elite, even the natural environment. It was a system that functioned silently, invisibly, yet its effects were undeniable. Animals behaved strangely near certain points, shadows moved against logic, and even the weather seemed to respond to the precise timing of the rituals, as if the estate itself had been conditioned. For the enslaved witnesses, the tension was unbearable. They were privy to knowledge they could never share, aware of forces operating beyond comprehension, and yet powerless to resist. Every ritual demanded meticulous participation, forcing them to internalize Helena's methods and, inadvertently, her authority. Fear intertwined with fascination. Curiosity became compulsion. By now, even the slightest deviation from her expectations would trigger a subtle but unmistakable correction, a glance, a word, a gesture that reinforced her dominance. Helena's influence was no longer confined to Willowbend. Patterns in Montgomery society mirrored the marks and behaviors cultivated in the cellar. Allies and rivals alike fell into alignment with the rhythms she established. Her knowledge, painstakingly acquired and executed, had transcended superstition. It was operational mastery. She was no longer a widow managing an estate, she was a conductor of unseen forces, a manipulator of perception, a quiet architect of obedience. Those who witnessed her power directly, Esther, Celia, Moses, and the others, understood that Helena's reach extended far beyond what any mortal had a right to command. By late September, the consequences of Helena Ruddle's midnight designs became undeniable. 3 of the 7 witnesses, quiet, observant, and once predictable, vanished from all records. Esther, Celia, and Moses noticed their absence not as coincidence but as the silent hand of a system that operated beyond comprehension. The courthouse records would later obscure their fates, leaving no trace, as though Helena's influence had reached into the very machinery of governance, erasing lives with the same precision she used to etch symbols into the cellar floor. What she had begun in secrecy was now rewriting reality itself. Those who remained at Willowbend began to sense the weight of authority that extended beyond physical control. Helena's rituals were no longer performances. They had become instruments of psychological architecture. The 7 witnesses, once observers, were now part of the mechanism. Every step in the cellar, every adjustment of a chair or gesture, reinforced invisible hierarchies. The marks on her wrist, once merely symbolic, had become keys, identifiers of alignment, loyalty, and power. Other women in Montgomery society displayed similar marks, invisible to those who were not attuned, yet binding them into a network of obedience that Helena manipulated with subtlety and perfection. Even the natural world responded. Animals avoided certain sections of the estate, the wind shifted strangely near ritual sites, and the cellar itself seemed to hum with a presence that could not be explained by human perception. Helena's mastery over ritual had become mastery over perception itself, bending reality in subtle, insidious ways. Those under her influence could not name it, could not measure it, yet they felt its effect in every glance, every sound, every shadow. Helena had become a vector, a node of control connecting human psychology, environmental cues, and social networks into a lattice of unseen power. The enslaved witnesses, now fully aware of the stakes, experienced a complex terror. Fear, fascination, and submission were fused into a single unbreakable response. They carried the rituals in their memory, recalling every syllable, every mark, every vibration of the cellar's stone. Helena had taught them compliance through awe, shaping minds without violence, embedding loyalty through observation and silent participation. This was not brute force. It was refinement, a curriculum in domination that left them simultaneously privileged, vulnerable, and irrevocably altered. In Montgomery, whispers began to circulate among those who noticed the patterns. Wealth shifted inexplicably, alliances realigned, and individuals with Helena's marks demonstrated behaviors that were unaccountably precise, disciplined, and deferential. Power had become a contagion, a lattice of obedience that Helena cultivated in darkness. And for those at Willowbend, there was no escape. Every moment spent in her orbit reinforced the structure she had built, a structure that reached outward, unseen, into society and beyond, bending perception and action to her will. By autumn of 1845, Helena Ruddle's control had reached its apex. Willowbend was no longer simply a plantation, a house, or a cellar. It had become a crucible where human perception, fear, and loyalty were forged into instruments of power. The 7 witnesses Esther, Celia, Moses, Isaiah, Rachel, Thomas, and Benjamin were no longer merely observers or servants. They were conduits for Helena's will, absorbing the rhythm, the symbols, the cadence of her rituals, and internalizing them until their own thoughts were entwined with hers. Obedience was no longer enforced. It had been architected, built into the very framework of their cognition. The rituals had grown more precise, more demanding, and more unyielding. Helena required absolute focus, and the women who joined her in the cellar moved with a purpose that bordered on obsession. Each syllable spoken in their cryptic language resonated beyond comprehension, a mechanism of conditioning designed to bind attention and loyalty. Esther could feel the vibrations in her chest, the way the cadence of the ritual aligned with her heartbeat, bending her mind toward a single axis of awareness: Helena's authority. Celia, standing silently in the corner, felt her own curiosity shift into compulsion. The line between fascination and fear had dissolved entirely. Helena's obsession extended to objects as well as people. Symbols were carved, vials filled with substances whose purpose was unknown but whose effect was unmistakable. Even the scratches on the cellar floor, once thought decorative, now formed precise geometric patterns, calibrated to influence perception, attention, and emotion. The ritual space was a matrix, a blueprint for control. Every motion, every whisper, every placement was deliberate. The 7 witnesses were now part of a system that could transmit dominance without violence, bending human behavior invisibly, silently, irreversibly. Outside the cellar, the effects were creeping into the wider community. Other women in Montgomery society bore Helena's mark, subtle, nearly invisible, yet binding them into the lattice of her influence. Wealth and power shifted without explanation. Loyalties reoriented. Those who resisted or hesitated found themselves subtly marginalized, their actions constrained by currents they could not perceive. Helena's rituals had transcended superstition or superstitious magic. They had become operational mastery of human networks, psychology, and influence. For the witnesses, the psychological cost was immense. Fear, awe, and fascination fused into a single, unbreakable tension. Sleep became uneasy. Shadows seemed to move with intent. The cellar hummed with memory, a resonance embedded into their very minds. They could never unlearn what they had seen. Helena's obsession, her precision, her absolute command of ritual and influence, had transformed Willowbend into a theater of hidden power where every thought, every glance, every gesture was measured, calibrated, and directed. They had become living instruments of her will, walking conduits for knowledge and authority no outsider could comprehend. By the end of 1845, Willowbend was no longer just a plantation. It had become a repository of forbidden knowledge, a living archive of influence and control meticulously crafted by Helena Rutledge. The 7 witnesses had been irrevocably changed. Each carried within them the memory of rituals, the rhythm of incantations, the echo of strange languages, and the imprint of Helena's authority. They could no longer distinguish between their own will and the subtle commands embedded into their perception. Fear and fascination were inseparable. Helena had not simply ruled over them, she had conditioned them, rewired their minds, and created vessels of her design. Outside the cellar, her influence continued to radiate. The marks on the wrists of elite women spread silently through Montgomery society, invisible to those not attuned to the patterns, yet shaping alliances, wealth, and obedience. Decisions once thought independent now reflected Helena's network of control. Business, politics, and social order bent subtly to her influence, as though an unseen hand was guiding the currents of power. Even after the rituals ended, the mechanisms she had built continued to operate. Willowbend itself seemed to pulse with memory, the cellar retaining the echoes of sound, movement, and energy, a space charged with authority that could be felt long after those who enacted it had left. For the witnesses, life after Helena's ceremonies was irreversibly altered. Sleep was haunted by echoes of voices in languages they could not name, shadows moving against logic, the faint metallic rhythm of tools striking stone. Esther, Celia, Moses, and the others carried a knowledge they could never share, a secret that could not survive exposure. The courthouse sealed the testimony not for convenience but to protect lives, to prevent the diffusion of power too dangerous for ordinary society. 3 witnesses disappeared entirely, leaving only silence where human presence had once been. Their fates became part of the lattice Helena had woven absent, yet still accounted for in her design. Helena Rutledge's legacy was subtle but unbreakable. She had transformed fear, fascination, and obedience into instruments of control, extending beyond her immediate sphere into the very fabric of society. Willowbend remained a silent sentinel, a monument to calculated obsession, where objects, shadows, and memory carried the weight of invisible authority. Those who had been present knew that what had occurred in the cellar was not superstition, nor mere ritual, it was operational mastery, a blueprint for influence that could bend human behavior and perception without force. For you, watching now, understanding this is dangerous knowledge. Helena Rutledge's methods are a mirror of the unseen architectures of control that exist in every age, every society. The rituals, the marks, the patterns all demonstrate the invisible levers that shape human action and thought. Remember what you have learned here, reflect on it, and recognize that once knowledge enters the mind, it cannot be erased. Willowbend lives on, not in brick or soil, but in the understanding of those who perceive the subtle frameworks of power hidden in plain sight. This is the forbidden truth. The witnesses, the rituals, the marks, they were never meant to be known. But now you know. Comment twice. I see what others cannot, to unlock the hidden truths they tried to bury. Dare to descend into forbidden history.